Fox News confirming some big changes for America's counter-terror strategy as we see a significant drop in drone strikes since the president announced a major policy shift back in May. The move is being called a reaction to protests over U.S. policies and not a proactive strategy on a part of the administration. But with news of the continued terror attacks on Westerners and others overseas, there are serious questions about whether now is the time to be limiting our military strategies. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North is a Fox News military analyst, joins us live. Colonel, good to see you today.
Shannon, great to be with you. There's no doubt that the number of strikes by remotely piloted aircraft have dropped in the last few months and that the number of radical Islamic terror attacks have increased. We don't want to give our enemies info they don't need to know, so let's keep this kind of general. First of all, the number of unarmed reconnaissance and intelligence drones, as they're incorrectly called by our colleagues in the media, is less than 600. The number of armed MQ drones, those that can carry ordnance like the Hellfire missile, is less than 300. And there's a limited number of trained operators, communications hubs, secure satellite channels, and of course a limited number of maintenance, arming, launch, and recovery sites. For example, Iraq, where we used to launch a lot of these, is no longer available as a place where Americans can launch these. But it's not just drone strikes. We've also cut back on all kinds of counterterrorism operations. Last year, we were in Somalia with Kenyan and Ugandan units, the ones that drove al-Shabaab out of Mogadishu. Special operations deployments in Africa have been cut since we were out in Somalia just last year. The number of U.S. vessels deployed in the Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, Persian Gulf have all been cut back. And this will make news. The DEA FAST units, the 4 deployed advisory and support teams which operated with U.S. military special operations units to attack the very heart of narco-terrorist organizations, is now being disbanded by the Justice Department. That does not leave us in great shape, Shannon.
Well, speaking of the Justice Department, the Attorney General Eric Holder said today that we have degraded the core of al-Qaeda and that what we're seeing now are just sort of some random offshoots that are not at that core. There are other groups, maybe more independent. So the way that we're proceeding as an administration is working.
Well, look, saying you've degraded the core of al-Qaeda says that, okay, you took down one tank on the part of the enemy battlefield. The fact is, what we're seeing is an administration that doesn't get it in terms of who the enemy is. Al-Qaeda is just one franchise in a global radical Islamic movement. The president said at the UN this week that we need to, quote, step back from perpetual war footing. Well, I remind everybody, we didn't start this war. The radical Islamists did. And while we're navel-gazing about a government shutdown, America's enemies are dying at the hands, America's allies are dying at the hands of radical Islamic terrorists like that in the Philippines, which now is experiencing the greatest upshoot in terrorism by radical Islamist groups, and we're not even covering it.
Well, I want to refer to some comments from Congressman Mike Rogers, a Republican who heads up the House Intelligence Committee. He said he's very concerned about some of the changes that have been going on along these lines, and he says, quote, "This is no time to retreat." Is that how you view it?
Absolutely correct. The idea that somehow, by being nicer, that we're going to step back from a, quote, war footing means that we're not going to defend ourselves. And with this kind of operation, Shannon, requires that we take the offensive. And when you start giving up ground where you can even launch remotely piloted aircraft, like, for example, Iraq, it makes it far more difficult to do the kinds of things that we ought to be doing to make sure America's enemies don't get a foothold.
Well, these are new developments. It's interesting that you point out the numbers. We will see as we continue to face threats around the globe if this is the stay the course plan. Colonel North, good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon.